Okay, so here we are in the topic of wetlands and coastal zone management for this week. And as I've said in messages and say on the page for the week, it's a bit of a funny week because of the Friday holiday. So it's technically, quote unquote, a two-class week. I'm asking the Friday seminar folks to move to Wednesday, so each of you will participate in a seminar, either in person for those of you that normally are Mondays and Wednesdays, and then a parallel Wednesday session online. And we'll keep them separate; they'll just be at the same time for the Friday group. So long and short is because of that, we will have only one recorded lecture. Now, one recorded lecture doesn't mean actually one recorded lecture. I'm going to do a series of videos here, including keeping the videos that I record on the topics of wetlands and coastal zone management distinct. But in both cases, I'm keeping them, in all cases, with my own videos and the other videos I'm asking you to watch, I'm keeping them pretty brief. So in total, you won't have more than a single lecture here. All right, so with that, let's get talking about wetlands. So what is a wetland? Well, nobody can say it better than Bill Nye, the science guy. Not sure if I should know this, if he's still on TV or not, or if he was when you guys were kids. But I know from my childhood, definitely a inspirational, educational guy. And so his funny video. It's obviously an older video, but funny video nonetheless on what is a wetland. It's I think useful to at least have an understanding. I'm expecting that some of you will say, "Oh my God, this is really basic." Especially if you're, for example, studying water resource management or something. I'm sure I assume you know this content already, and so you can either skip it or watch it and kind of whatever do something else at the same time, just to make sure we're all on the same page. But for some of you, frankly, this may not be. You may not actually know the answer to this question of what a wetland is, and so, even though this is a very basic video, obviously, I think it's useful at least to have an understanding of what we mean by wetlands. And so, I definitely would encourage you to take a look at that video. And so, what is a wetland? Well, what does Bill Nye say? It's wet and it's land. Imagine that. But in all seriousness, we can characterize wetlands in different ways, and of course there are different types of wetlands. But in wetlands, we're going to find certain varieties of, I shouldn't say just plant life here, flora and fauna that that we find unique to wetlands, or that are dependent upon wetlands. In some cases, they're going to be unique to wetlands. So we think of certain varieties of plant life that we only find in wetlands, obviously, and that therefore are contingent upon their existence is contingent upon the existence of wetlands, certain varieties of grass, certain types of flowers, and so on and so forth. And then we certainly have fauna, various fauna, that are absolutely dependent on wetland. They may not spend their entire lives in wetlands, but if we think, for example, of migratory birds or a variety of migratory bird species that depend on wetlands and wetland habitat for at least parts of their lives, say when they're in transit for food, as sources of fish, for example, or crabs, or other flora and fauna that they're going to depend upon, that they can find in wetlands and as habitat for living in, for nesting in, and so on and so forth. By its nature, when we talk about a wetland, we're talking about an area that has surface water, at least at certain key times. Some wetlands may be only seasonally wet and can go dry, but they have water, surface water, at least at key times. They're hydric in nature, i.e. they're anaerobic, low in oxygen, characterized by low anaerobic soils. They're poorly drained, and typically, even when in drier parts, the surface water, the water table is going to be very high. There's an important distinction to be made between inland freshwater wetlands, which are about 95% of the wetlands in the United States, obviously the vast majority of wetlands, and coastal wetlands. And even though coastal wetlands only make up 5% of wetlands, are certainly critically important. We can make a sub-distinction in inland wetlands or freshwater wetlands between lacustrine wetlands, which are on the shores of lakes and ponds, riverine, obviously along rivers, and palustrine, which are marshes surrounded by dry land, and that those are also key distinctions when we talk about inland wetlands. I think we've historically had a less than positive view of wetlands. If you look at the arc of human history, I shouldn't say human history necessarily, but kind of modern human history in the U.S. context at least. We tend to think of them as kind of wasteland, swampland. We have treated them poorly, right? As kind of a place to dump our waste. And yeah, aside from kind of thinking of them as this kind of places where we can just dump our waste, I've paid relatively little attention for them. And in some ways that's a shame, and it's out of ignorance to just how important wetlands are and what they're good for. Certainly, wetlands have been the played integral roles in terms of flood and storm surge protection. They really, in many ways, are the sponges of our environment. And so, as floodwaters rise, wetlands have an amazing capacity to suck up that water, as I said, like a sponge. Erosion control, so wetland grasses and so on, are really critically important for holding sediment and mitigating or reducing erosion. For stormwater absorption, as I said, with storm surge protection, same thing. If we think about runoff, and now we have a better understanding of the issues associated with stormwater runoff, and I think we have increasing appreciation for the value that wetlands can play, and constructed wetlands are playing, for example, in helping us to hold stormwater rather than losing it through this kind of rapid flush through the system into rivers, into lakes, into the oceans. That instead of, for example, constructed wetlands, how we can hold that water and recharge our groundwater tables. Filtering of sediment, chemicals, and nutrients. So again, we think about not just erosion control, holding sediment and holding soil down, but actually filtering sediment, filtering dangerous potentially chemicals and nutrients like nitrogen. That's really important, that the way they can play that incredible filtering role in order to increase water quality. Aquifer recharge, for the reasons I just mentioned, right? If they're holding water, that water is staying in place and is over time absorbed back into the ground and recharges aquifers. And so wetlands play a critical role in the water cycle in that aquifer recharge, and their loss has been catastrophic in terms of losing that recharge or reducing the recharge rate. Fish and wildlife habitat, as I mentioned before. Carbon sinks, you may not think of that, but obviously plants require carbon dioxide to grow, algae require carbon dioxide to grow. So if we think about carbon sinks, wetlands can be critically important there. In fact, a wetland can be a much more productive source of a carbon sink, a much more effective carbon sink than, for example, planting many species of trees. And last but not least is open space, right? Is recreational areas. And while I mentioned, that not so long ago we treated wetlands as these kind of, dumps that we kind of didn't pay a lot of attention to, the swamp, the kind of place that we didn't want to, think much about. But now we think about their open space value for recreational purposes much more, I think, much more explicitly and intentionally. And I think because we haven't really appreciated the value of wetlands, we haven't treated them very well. We've put a lot of pressure on our wetlands. In fact, more than half of the original wetlands in the lower 48 states, which is about 117 million acres, have been filled. Imagine that for a moment. About half. That's an incredible ratio of our wetlands lost. And the pressures on them have been enormous. If you look at the left side, obviously that's a coastal wetland that's in Boston. And the dark bits there are what was sort of, I guess you could say, natural Boston before it was filled in, the way the topography would look if there was no human intervention. And you see Boston was kind of this coast of little peninsulas and islands and so on in Boston Harbor. And then all that lighter green color is fill, right? And think about that. Look at that for a moment. Just think about how much fill that is. It's just amazing to me. But truth be told, a lot of what was around the islands and peninsulas before that fill was put in place wasn't open water, right? We have an imagination of kind of open water. Much of that, especially if we look in those bay areas, like for example Back Bay, which is now, well, the part where it says Back Bay right now on that lighter green fill is a whole neighborhood right across from Cambridge. If you look on the other side, you have MIT in that light green on the other side of the Charles River there. All of that would have been not so much open water, maybe some channels of open water for boats and so on, but most of that would have been swamp, right? Or wetland, I guess is a better way to put it. It would have been brackish wetland. And was lost, right? In that case, it was pressures from development, right? For the city to have land to expand on. And again, the view that it wasn't of value for anything else, and therefore we should just fill it in and turn it into quote-unquote productive land for development. If you look on the picture on the right side, we've certainly channelized our rivers, and so historically we would have had riverine wetlands, for example, along many of our rivers, and they would have played those really important attenuating roles in flood control, right? And so it would have been a natural process of a river expanding during wetter seasons, right? The river swells, it feeds into wetlands, and those wetlands serve really important absorption roles, filtration roles, and they're part of a natural cycle. Where the river drops down, the wetlands may become a little drier, but there's a whole system there. But that didn't fit our purposes, right? We wanted to be able to build along rivers. We wanted to build up to rivers for whether it's for, like in the case of the picture on the right, we see for industrial uses. In other cases, it might have been for agricultural uses. So we channelized our rivers, especially our major, big rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and so on and so forth. We channelized them. And in the process of doing so, of building these large levees and dike systems along rivers, we cut off those wetlands. We lost those wetlands. But there are lots of other examples, right? We think a lot of the wetlands, for example, are smaller wetlands on farms, for example, where farmers, purposely filled them in so that they could farm over that land. And I'm not necessarily blaming those farmers. Historically, that was just the thing you did. There was assumption that it was a productive thing to do, was to fill in wetlands, not really appreciating the loss of habitat. And ironically, in many of those cases, as I'll come back to in a moment here, that land ended up not being super productive anyway. The world has a way of pushing back. And so, for example, farmers will find that areas that were historically wetlands that they now try to plow over never really become very productive. Nonetheless, it's important to think about the pressures and therefore to think about what we can do about it. So I'm going to introduce a series of policies in a moment here, but just kind of at the broad level to say, it is something that's got more attention and been recognized for decades by governments of both parties. And so, for example, President George Bush, the senior, declared a national policy of no net loss of wetlands in 1989. And subsequent presidents have upheld that. So just to demonstrate that that it's not always a partisan issue with the environment, that it was George Bush Sr. that established that no net loss policy. I shouldn't say that subsequent administrations have always held that. There have been back and forths around exactly how wetlands would be defined, and it is very political. Like a lot of things we talk about this semester, it is very political, right? There are interests, and you can imagine what they might be, that are not so keen to hear that they have to, for example, preserve parts of their land for certain uses. And then, of course, there are others who are supportive of it, and so it becomes a political issue. But just to say that it's been widely recognized, the loss of wetlands and the need to protect wetlands going forward has been recognized, certainly, by both parties at various times. And so what is the government doing about it? And in particular, what is the government doing to advance that goal of no net loss of wetlands? And what are they doing about it when it's a particularly difficult task in light of the fact that about 75% of wetlands are on private property? So it introduces a whole suite of challenges around, it's not just federal land that can be managed in certain ways. It's private land where you're having to either enforce laws or incentivize landowners to do certain things. And that can be a major challenge, even when it's not a carrot, when it's a stick, when it's a rule. The oversight and monitoring can be very difficult. Nonetheless, there's a variety of legislation in place. So at the federal level, certainly Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is very important. It's the part of the act that establishes federal wetlands permits. And permits are required for any dredging or filling of wetlands. And again, while the definition of wetlands has changed over time and has been interpreted in different ways at various states, for example, by implementing authorities, that it, at least on paper, does set this requirement that any dredging or filling should require permitting. And it's been a really expensive program, right? So we spent more than $1.7 billion a year on permitting under this process. One way in which projects can go ahead, even when they are proposed for wetlands, is through mitigation measures, right? And so one way, and we're going to come into spend more time on that in a moment here, is through the notion of mitigation banks, right? But there are various ways in which developers or other project proponents may try to offset their proposed impacts on wetlands, right? So the mitigation bank is one, but just to put out there, because we're not going to spend more time on that when we move on, other things would be mitigating on-site. So, for example, essentially moving a wetland from one part of a parcel to another. A second would be buying a parcel somewhere else and protecting it. So, if I want to build a new housing development in an area that's has wetland in it, and I want to fill in that wetland, what I might do is buy a parcel somewhere else that's not as valuable from a real estate development perspective, and put it into, going back to last week's topic, put it into a conservation easement that essentially requires that it be maintained as a wetland in perpetuity. Or, as we're going to talk about here, you could put it into using mitigation banking. There are other sets of incentives, though. For example, the Farm Bill, right? One of the most expensive, largest, most contentious, often, acts of Congress, the Farm Bill, has traditionally included various incentives. So, for example, the Swamp Buster provision stipulates a loss of or reduction in federal subsidies for farmers that remove wetlands from their farms. It's a pretty big incentive, right? Farmers depend often, especially commodities farmers, on the Farm Bill, and so therefore that's a big loss if they're threatening their subsidies by destroying wetlands. And as I said before, various ways in which they might get subsidized for protecting pieces of their land, like conservation easements, grants, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, those are federal programs, but that there are a whole suite of state and local programs. And the chapter, of course, goes into these more. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but that more and more wetlands management is done at those levels. And that at the particular local level, measures can include zoning provisions, subdivision regulations, capital investments, various tools that we think of as planning tools can be brought to bear on protecting wetlands. Okay, so I asked you to watch the assignment Earth video on mitigation banks before watching this video. If you haven't done that, I would actually suggest that you pause this and check that out first, just because it gives a good overview of what a mitigation bank is and how it works. It's a pretty rosy picture of mitigation banks, but I don't think that's unfair. There are, in my opinion, at least pros and cons of mitigation banks as a way of addressing wetland loss and destruction or impact. I hope what's clear, long and short, of what they are in the broad sense is essentially, rather than somebody who wants to impact a wetland, doing some of the things I mentioned on the last slide, like putting a wetland elsewhere on the same property to mitigate the loss in one area, or buying a piece of land somewhere else themselves to offset and create new wetland and basically offset the loss with the proposed project, that they essentially outsource that work, right? And so instead of it being the same person, same developer doing the work, that they essentially become, the diagram here I think shows nicely that they, as the permittee, buy credits, pay a fee to buy credits from a mitigation banker, right? And so it could be, like the video shows, something like the Nature Conservancy, but generally it's an organization and not-for-profit or non-profit environmental organization that will play that banking role, right? That will buy lands that are maybe of particular value and sell, and this of course depends on having a banking system established, which many places do in the US, will sell the credits for that. So in other words, I will sell the mall developer or the housing developer the credits that allow them to do the impact on the wetland on their parcel, and I'm going to protect the area we've purchased in exchange. And one of the pros I would say of this is that it allows for, as the video showed, clustering, right? So it allows the banker to create a larger site, to get a larger site by accumulating the credits that they sell, the fees that they get from selling credits to various developers. It allows them to focus on particularly valuable wetlands, right? And so to protect or restore particularly valuable or fragile habitats. In exchange for, frankly, what could sometimes be wetland loss in areas that are of less import, right? Maybe the wetland that would be impacted is relatively minor and not particularly, important from a habitat perspective. And so they're actually getting more bang for their buck there. And it also allows professionals to do the job, right? And so mitigation bankers, those that are in that business, like TNC, like Nature Conservancy, are going to generally be better at it, right? They have the staff, they have the expertise to actually do a good job of it, as opposed to a developer trying to do, a poor job of creating a constructed wetland on their own parcel. Of course, it depends on, this, as you can see, the triangle here kind of shows this system with regulators also playing a role in terms of both the assessment of what is, how many credits need to be purchased, what is the impact by the permittee, basically approving the credit system, so how many credits should be allocated or can be sold off of a project, and generally monitoring the system with those goals of limiting ecological loss and protecting wetlands and habitat. I asked you if we were in class that we'd be having this discussion interactively, and it's a shame we're not. But I ask you, what do you think are the pros and cons? I've given you some here, but I hope you might have some you think of as well that I haven't thought of here. But I think what is important to understand is how they work, why they work, what are the players and their roles, and last but not least would be to have some sense of why they exist. What are they doing? Which is to say that it's a market-oriented approach to advancing our policies on wetland protection, restoration, and so on. Right? It's very much in that sort of vein of market-based solutions. And I think this table is interesting to look at. I think about this is certainly an argument for why environmental banks, some of the benefits they offer compared to some of the other solutions that might exist. So we talked about in lieu fees, where the permittee or developer is responsible for mitigating on-site, where they're responsible for donating land elsewhere. Things we talked about. And I think that these pros are genuine. But I would also ask you to appreciate that this is from an organization that, of course, is a proponent of these things, and so they're not all sunshine and roses. But I would encourage you to think about it and check out that link if you're interested in this. So there's a link at the bottom there. I'm not making it an assigned reading or anything for this week, but environmentalbanking.org. If you're interested in knowing more about some of the arguments for them and why they work, or can work, I should say. As I hope I've made clear, they're not necessarily wholly positive, though. So I'm not saying that we should not have these mitigation banks and these other market-oriented solutions, but that there are challenges. And a good friend of mine, Thijs van Massakers, a professor at Ohio State University, produced this book on the creation of ecosystem services marketplaces. And some of the things that Thijs talks about in his work, I think, that are really informative here, not necessarily explicitly on wetlands per se, although some of the issues are on wetlands. But I like the example of the tree planting. I think I might have mentioned this in class already, with the tree planting along banks to deal with essentially, in this case, it was temperature. So river temperature. Wastewater treatment plants are putting out water too warm of a temperature. It's out of their total maximum of temperature, and therefore they need to mitigate in some way, rather than them investing all the money in essentially cooling the water coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. It's cheaper to essentially pay others to do work. In the spirit of mitigation banks, to reduce the river temperature in other ways. And in this case, that is the case he looks at is in I believe it's Oregon, and that involved tree planting along the river, because if you shade the river, then you can obviously lower the temperature. Downside was that, of course, the tree planting was done with a very explicit goal of lowering the river temperature so those credits could be acquired, and didn't really take much account of things like habitat, right? So there's all monoculture tree species planted. Didn't take much account of things like really what would be the healthiest places to plant trees from, for example, other co-benefits like erosion. I'm assuming these tree plants did have some benefits there, but they only planted, for example, on the south side of rivers, because obviously if you're trying to shade a river, that's where you're worried about. So just to say that, it not necessarily bad things, but that we have to understand that when we put things into markets like this, they're likely to, the market will respond in ways that, in the most direct ways that are going to bring benefits through the market system, what they're being incentivized to do. And so we should understand that, right? They're not interested in necessarily the sort of things we would think of as broader, more comprehensive, comprehensive, holistic solutions. And the last thing I would say is when we think about wetland loss, and particularly the loss of the important functions wetlands play, nature often gets the last laugh. And I don't say that lightheartedly laugh. It's obviously quite sad. So the picture on the left here is older picture, but it was showing is the overtopping of the river. I believe it's the Mississippi River. Something so strange about those barges going down the quote-unquote river in the middle when everything around it looks like river at this time of massive flooding. And of course, as I said before, historically what we would have had is we would have had wetlands along rivers that would have played that important role of holding that water, of absorbing that water, and we wouldn't have the catastrophic loss because we would have respected those floodplains and wetlands and the roles they play, and therefore wouldn't have built in those specific areas. And of course, we wouldn't have the water flow over quite as large expanses because the floodplains and wetlands would have played their roles in holding it in particular areas. And we've lost that, right? When we channelized the rivers, when we paved over the wetlands, we lost that. And of course, we also lost the buffering, right? And so we don't think about the connection between wetlands, particularly coastal wetlands, and hurricane damage very often, but it's critically important. One of the big reasons why hurricanes have been, I'm not saying it's the only one necessarily, but one of the reasons why hurricanes have been so much more deadly in the Gulf Coast in Louisiana and so on is just the massive loss of coastal wetland. And those coastal wetlands used to absorb huge proportion of the energy of hurricanes, right? You have to imagine that the role they would play in slowing down hurricanes, and again absorbing or holding floodwaters that have been lost. And so in the face of that, we see, as we've seen this past week and many times this year, unfortunately, as a bad hurricane season, of impacts that maybe, I'm not saying would have been wholly protected, but it would have at least been potentially mitigated had we had better maintained our coastal wetlands. So that's wetlands. I hope a little bit of a, I don't want to say depressing, but it can be a little depressing story because we've really lost so much. But I think it's also important to recognize that we have acknowledged that loss and, at least in some ways, are trying to reverse that trend through innovative programs sometimes, and just through a general recognition that we need to invest more in our wetlands.